The house fell into an eerie silence when his parents handed me a thick contract and declared, "Sign this. All your assets now belong to the family." My husband, Daniel, smirked from across the table, his gaze intense. "It's just a formality, babe," he added, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing, then I smiled. "Then you'll love what's in my safe deposit box." The room went cold. Daniel's smile faltered, and I could see the panic flicker in his eyes for just a second. His parents, William and Eleanor, looked at me in horror, their faces twisting as they exchanged glances. I held my ground, savoring the moment. Without a word, the butler stepped into the room, interrupting the tense silence. "Ma'am, your lawyer is here." I could have sworn I saw Daniel's face turn a shade lighter. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her wine glass, her knuckles turning white. William's jaw clenched, his expression hardening. They had clearly expected me to be surprised, maybe even flattered by their proposition. But I wasn't going to play along. I had met Daniel 6 years ago in Chicago in my late 20s. I was focused on my career, having worked relentlessly to establish myself. Real estate was my passion. I flipped houses, made smart investments, and built a comfortable life. It wasn't flashy, but it was solid and secure. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed like he was born into wealth, or so I thought. He had the charm, the confidence, and the expensive tastes. He never discussed his finances in detail, but everything around him screamed money. The latest gadgets, the designer suits, the pristine cars. Everything had the unmistakable mark of someone who came from old money. His parents, William and Eleanor, were the epitome of that old money attitude. They lived in a massive, sprawling mansion filled with antique furniture and family portraits. The kind of house where every inch whispered wealth, heritage, and legacy. The kind of place that was so pristine, it felt almost untouchable. It felt like something out of a historical novel. But there was something about Daniel's family that didn't sit right with me. They had this strange, almost condescending way of speaking to me. "You're so lucky to be joining our family," they would say, as if they were bestowing some great honor upon me. Eleanor had once told me that a woman like me must be thrilled to have this kind of stability. That was a line I couldn't shake. Why did they assume I needed stability? Didn't they know that I had built my own success without the safety net of family wealth? Still, I ignored the nagging feeling. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Daniel had his moments that made me uneasy too, like when he borrowed money and forgot to pay it back, or that time he suggested I put my name on a house he wanted to buy to make things easier for tax reasons. I shut that idea down immediately, but even so, I let these little red flags slide. After all, I trusted him, didn't I? I loved him. That is, until the night they made their move. It had been 2 years since Daniel and I were married, and his parents had invited us over for dinner at their estate. This was nothing new. They liked their fancy dinners, the expensive wine, and the long conversations about legacy and tradition, the same tired subjects. But that night was different. The moment we sat down, the atmosphere shifted. There was a palpable tension in the air, one that I could almost taste. Daniel seemed unusually excited, his eyes sparkling. Eleanor practically glowed, her smile wide and unsettlingly sweet. William, ever the stoic figure, sat at the head of the table with a satisfied smirk on his face. Something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The tension thickened as the dinner progressed, and halfway through the meal, William cleared his throat and pulled out a thick stack of papers. He placed them before me as if they were a gift. The paper rustled as he slid it toward me, and I glanced at Daniel. "We've been thinking about the future," Eleanor said, her voice warm, almost maternal. "About what's best for the family." I met Daniel's gaze, trying to read his expression. His eyes were locked on me, expectant. "We need to ensure stability," William added, his voice firm. "This contract will allow us to combine our resources, one strong financial unit, working together." I picked up the first page and began reading. My stomach turned as I absorbed the contents. They wanted me to sign over everything. My savings, my investments, my real estate portfolio, even my personal bank accounts. All of it would go into a family trust, which of course was controlled entirely by them. I felt a knot form in my chest. The contract was nothing short of a power grab, a calculated move to secure control over everything I had worked so hard to build. Daniel, oblivious to my growing fury, smiled at me, his voice dripping with assurance. "It's just a formality, babe," he said. "You trust me, don't you?" Something inside me snapped. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow breath before I smiled, my voice calm and steady. "Then you'll love what's in my safe deposit box." The room froze. Daniel's smile faltered, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Eleanor's fingers trembled around her wine glass, and William's jaw tightened. They hadn't expected this. They thought they had me cornered, but they didn't know me. "What's in the box?" Daniel asked, his voice tight, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, just some paperwork," I said casually. "A few documents. A little something I put together before we got married, for protection." The silence that followed was deafening. And then, as if on cue, the butler entered the room. "Ma'am, your lawyer is here." If only I had a camera to capture their faces. Daniel's face went pale. Eleanor looked like she had swallowed a lemon. William, ever the stoic one, just stared at me, his grip on the contract tightening. A moment later, Teresa, my lawyer, walked in with an air of confidence. "Good evening," she said, setting her briefcase down on the table. "I understand there's a contract my client is expected to sign." Eleanor was the first to recover. "This is a private family matter," she snapped, her voice sharp with authority. "There's no need for lawyers." Teresa ignored her, picking up the contract and flipping through the pages. Her eyes scanned the text quickly, and then, with a short laugh, she shook her head. "Wow," she said, almost incredulously. "This is blatant financial manipulation." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It's not like that," he began, but Teresa cut him off. "Actually, it is," she said flatly. She turned to me. "If you signed this, they would have complete control over your assets. They could drain your accounts, sell your properties, and you wouldn't be able to do a thing about it." Eleanor's face turned red with fury. "It's just about trust," she protested, her voice sickly sweet. Teresa raised an eyebrow. "Right," she said dryly. "That's why this contract explicitly states they would have control over withdrawals, property sales, and all financial decisions. But you would have no access without approval." She turned back to me, her expression softening. "Good thing you have a lawyer who actually reads the fine print." Daniel stood abruptly, the tension in his body palpable. "Why are you acting like this?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Why are you making such a big deal out of this?" I stared at him, my voice calm but firm. "Why am I acting like this? You just tried to steal everything." Eleanor's voice, dripping with false sweetness, tried to salvage the situation. "Sweetheart, this is just a misunderstanding." I shook my head. "No, it's not." I took a deep breath, feeling a rush of clarity and resolve. "And I think I'm done here." As I stood to leave, Daniel's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. It wasn't hard, but it was firm enough to make a statement. His smirk was gone, replaced by something colder, more menacing. "Don't do this," he muttered under his breath, his voice low and tight with anger. "You don't want to make a scene." But I had already made my decision. My assets, my choices, and my future would no longer be subject to their manipulation. And with that, I walked out, leaving Daniel and his parents to stew in their own scheming silence. Enemies. They were all around me. My hand jerked away from the table, and I looked Eleanor dead in the eyes. The pressure in my chest built, but I refused a break. She smiled a thin, practiced smile, but the nervousness was clear in her eyes. "Darling, you're overreacting," she said, her voice high-pitched and full of false calm. She placed a hand delicately over her chest, the gesture so theatrical it could have been straight from a soap opera. "This is all a misunderstanding. We never meant to hurt you. I didn't speak a word. I was beyond words. Instead, I simply stared, my gaze unwavering." She pressed on. "We only meant to protect you. This world, it's dangerous. Money can be lost so easily, and we just want to make sure you were safe, that we were all safe." "Safe? Safe from what?" I didn't need to ask. The answer was clear. The only thing they were trying to protect was their own greed, their own interests. And I wasn't buying it. Teresa, my lawyer, remained composed, but the way she crossed her arms betrayed her skepticism. If that were true, she said, her voice sharp, then why did you structure the trust so that my client has no control over her own money? Eleanor's eyes flickered for just a moment, her perfectly manicured hands clutching the armrest of the chair. It was a subtle crack in her carefully constructed facade, but she quickly recovered, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. William, Eleanor's husband, sighed loudly, a sound that clearly conveyed his impatience. His gaze darted between me and Daniel, sitting just beside him. This is becoming unnecessary, he said, his voice low and controlled. Let's just move forward like adults. Like adults? I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Like adults? I echoed, my voice rising. You mean like how adults try to steal from their own family? The room went quiet. William's face darkened, his jaw tightening as if he were about to explode. But I wasn't intimidated. I wasn't afraid of them anymore. What they didn't realize was how desperate they were, how transparent their scheming had become. They thought I was too naive to see through their lies. They thought I would be too shocked, too emotionally drained to think clearly. But they were wrong. I was seeing the truth now. And then Eleanor dropped the bombshell. I suppose, she began with a soft sigh, as if she were laying some hidden, precious secret slip. This means you're not interested in inheritance either? My head snapped toward her. Inheritance? I didn't know what she was talking about. Daniel's face went pale, and I could feel the tension in the room rise. Eleanor didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she didn't care. Oh, she continued with an airy, almost mocking tone. Didn't Daniel tell you about his grandfather's estate? The one in Rhode Island? The family's real wealth. My pulse quickened as I processed her words. The estate, that wasn't just a rumor. It was real, and it was in probate. Eleanor's words hung in the air, heavy with implications I wasn't ready for. Teresa's eyes flicked to mine, and we both understood the same thing at that exact moment. This wasn't just about the money in the trust. It was about something far bigger. The estate's in probate. Eleanor continued, her tone casual, as if we were talking about the weather. And soon we'll have full control over it. But with your attitude, she trailed off, letting her words linger, dangling the promise of more wealth in front of me like a carrot on a stick. But I wasn't fooled. I didn't see this as an opportunity. It was a manipulation, a trap, a family with a history of taking what didn't belong to them. They were always scheming, always trying to get their hands on something they didn't deserve. And now I was the next target. I turned to Daniel, my voice barely a whisper, barely a growl. Were you ever going to tell me about this? He ran a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable. I was going to bring it up later, when the timing was better. Better for who? I shot back, my patience running thin. He didn't answer. We both knew the truth. He had never planned on telling me. Not ever. We left that night in silence. In the car, Teresa sat beside me, rubbing her temples as if trying to ease a headache that had been building for days. You realize what this means, right? I nodded, my mind still reeling from the revelation. Yeah, I muttered. They were after more than just my money. Exactly. Teresa's voice was firm. She tapped her fingers against her briefcase. If this estate is as valuable as they're making it sound, you can bet they'll stop at nothing to keep control of it. My gaze drifted out the window, my thoughts racing. The pieces were falling into place. What are the odds Daniel has debt? I asked. Teresa's eyes shot to mine, narrowing. You think he's hiding something? I know he is, I said, my voice cold. It all makes sense now. The expensive suits, the flashy lifestyle, the way he always talks like he has money, but never actually pays for anything. If he was in debt, then this trust wasn't just about controlling me. It was about saving his own skin. The next morning, I did something I should have done a long time ago. I hired a private investigator. I needed to know everything. His finances, his credit history, his past business dealings, everything. The investigator came back with a report that made my stomach churn. Daniel was drowning in debt. Multiple credit cards maxed out. Personal loans. And to make it worse, he'd taken out a business loan under my name, without telling me. The fury inside me was blinding. Not only had he lied to me, but he'd stolen from me. That night, I confronted him. My hands shook with anger as I slammed the papers onto the table. How long have you been stealing from me? I demanded. He blinked, his face a mass of confusion. What are you talking about? I didn't give him the chance to play innocent. You took out a loan under my name. You've been hiding debt, lying to me, and you wanted me to sign away everything so you could fix your mess. For the first time, he didn't try to deny it. Instead, he did something worse. He laughed. A bitter, cold laugh that sent a chill through me. You were always so damn careful, he muttered, shaking his head. I thought I could make you see the bigger picture, that you'd understand we needed to be smart about our future. But you just don't get it, do you? My chest tightened with a mix of disbelief and disgust. So this was always a plan? He looked up at me, his face unreadable. You have no idea what you've just started. I stepped back, my body tense with rage. Are you threatening me? He didn't answer. He just gave me one last, piercing look before grabbing his coat and walking out the door. The sound of it closing behind him was deafening. I stood there, my fists clenched, my entire body shaking with fury. I wasn't scared. I was angry. And if Daniel thought this was over, he was dead wrong. That night, sleep wouldn't come. My mind raced through every lie, every manipulation, every moment I had let him deceive me. And in the early hours of the morning, my phone buzzed. Teresa, she said, her voice laced with urgency. You need to come to my office now. I didn't ask questions. I just got in my car and drove. When I walked into the office, she was already waiting, sitting behind a large desk with a file neatly placed in front of her. Her expression was grave, her lips tight. You're not going to like this, she warned, sliding the file toward me. I hesitated, but opened it anyway. The moment I saw the contents, my blood ran cold. There were pictures, 2 women, both younger than me and stunning. And then a sense of dread settled in my stomach. I looked up at Teresa, searching her eyes. What's this? She leaned forward, her voice cold but composed. Meet Lisa and Hannah. I froze, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. Teresa continued, flipping through the papers in front of her. Lisa was with him 2 years ago, she explained. He promised to marry her, took out a loan in her name, drained her savings, and then ghosted her, left her with nothing but debt. I felt a sickening knot form in my stomach. How could someone do that? She flipped to the next page. Hannah was last year. Same story, except he never actually broke things off with her, just kept stringing her along. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stared at the pictures in front of me, trying to comprehend what I was hearing. Daniel, my husband, had been cheating, but not just with one woman. There were 2 of them, and he had been playing all of us. Wait, I said, my voice shaky. So he was cheating on me with both of them? Teresa nodded, her expression tight with frustration. Yes, but here's the kicker. She flipped to another document, her finger pointing to something on the page. He was also engaged to Hannah. I blinked in disbelief. What? Teresa nodded again. Slowly, he proposed to her, gave her a ring, planned a wedding. She thinks they're getting married in 6 weeks. My mouth went dry. So, he was married to me, engaged to her, and scamming both of us? Teresa let out a long exhale. Pretty much. And that's when it hit me. The Rhode Island estate, his family's fortune. It wasn't just money he wanted. He needed access to that inheritance. And to get it, he needed a wife on paper. That's why he kept me around, why he pushed for the trust. He wasn't just trying to steal my money. He was trying to replace me before I figured it out. I was no longer just a wife. I was a pawn in his sick game. I needed to talk to Hannah. I needed answers. The next day, Teresa set up a private meeting at a coffee shop. When I saw Hannah walk in, a wave of pity washed over me. She was glowing, practically floating with excitement, clearly head over heels in love with Daniel. She had no idea what kind of monster she was about to marry. I introduced myself, my voice calm but firm. I'm Daniel's wife. The moment I said his name, her face changed. The lightness drained from her eyes, replaced by suspicion. How do you know him? She asked, her voice tight. Because he's my husband. The room went silent. Her expression shifted instantly, her eyes wide with disbelief. That's not possible, she whispered. I reached into my bag, pulled out my wedding ring, and placed it on the table between us. Hannah's hands trembled as she reached into her own bag. She pulled out her engagement ring and placed it next to mine. Identical. A tear slid down her cheek as she looked at me, her voice barely a whisper. He told me we were going to start a new life together. He promised me everything, an inheritance, a life of luxury. But he's been using me. I clenched my fists, the anger building. Do you still have contact with him? She nodded, wiping her eyes. He's supposed to take me to meet his family this weekend. I exhaled slowly, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. We're going to crash that little reunion. Hannah agreed, and we began working together in secret. She kept up the facade, texting him, playing along with the engagement. Meanwhile, I dug into his finances. I hired a forensic accountant who uncovered a hidden offshore account where Daniel had been funneling money. The debts I had already found were just the tip of the iceberg. And then I dug into his family. The Rhode Island estate wasn't legally his yet. The probate process was still ongoing, and they needed a stable heir to take control. Daniel was supposed to be that person, married and secure in his claim. But now, thanks to my digging, I had everything I needed to destroy him. The night of the family dinner came quickly. Daniel thought he was bringing his innocent fiancée to meet his loving parents. What he didn't know was that he was about to get the shock of his life. I walked in first, my heart racing but my face calm. His parents were already seated at the grand dining table, sipping wine and chatting. They looked up when I entered, confusion immediately flashing across Eleanor's face. "What are you doing here?" she snapped. I smiled sweetly, my voice laced with calm authority. I wouldn't miss family night for anything. Behind me, Daniel entered, his arm around Hannah, walking with a wide grin on his face. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me. His face drained of color, and the panic settled in as his brain scrambled to find an escape. "Babe," he said, forcing a smile at Hannah. "Why is she here?" Hannah crossed her arms, her voice steely. "You tell me." There was a long, heavy silence. Eleanor stood abruptly, her face red with anger. "This is ridiculous. I won't have this drama at my table." I raised my hand, cutting her off. "Oh, trust me, you're going to want to hear this." I turned toward Teresa, who had been quietly standing by the doorway, waiting. "Would you like to begin?" I asked her. Teresa stepped forward, a cold smile on her lips as she flipped open the first page of her file. "Let's start with fraud," she said, her voice cutting through the air. "And then we'll get to bigamy." The room exploded. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. William slammed his glass down, furious. Hannah, her face flushed with a mix of disbelief and anger, threw her engagement ring at Daniel's chest, her voice shaking with emotion. "You lied to me," she screamed. "But Daniel?" He just sat there, frozen, staring at me with wide eyes, his face the picture of terror. He had nowhere to run. And as I watched him crumble, all I could think was how badly he'd underestimated me. The room was thick with tension, the kind that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. The air felt heavy, charged with the weight of unspoken accusations and raw, unfiltered hatred that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. I sat at the head of the table, my hands resting calmly in my lap. But inside, I was a storm. I had waited for this moment, planned for it, and now it was here. Daniel sat across from me, his face pale, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles twitching. He knew I had destroyed him, and the best part? I wasn't finished yet. The silence that followed was deafening. Not the kind of silence where people are processing information, or the kind where someone is waiting to speak. No, this was the kind of silence that comes before a bomb explodes. The calm before the storm. Daniel sat frozen, gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. His mother, Eleanor, sat beside him, her face twisted in a mixture of horror and fury. Her mouth open and closed like she wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. His father, William, just stared ahead, his face a mask of resignation, as if the weight of every bad decision he'd ever made was crashing down on him all at once. Then, Eleanor broke the silence. "This is absurd," she spat, her voice shrill and trembling. "Where did you even get this ridiculous claim?" Teresa, my lawyer and the calmest person in the room, placed a thick folder onto the table and slid it toward them. "It's all in there," she said simply, her tone cool and professional. "Bank records, loan documents, forged signatures. And oh," she reached for another paper, "proof that Daniel took out a business loan under his wife's name without her knowledge. That alone is a felony." Daniel flinched, his eyes darting to the folder like it was a live grenade. Eleanor slammed her hand on the table, her rings clinking against the wood. "This is a family matter," she snapped, her voice rising. "No," I said, my voice steady and firm. "This stopped being a family matter the moment you tried to steal from me. This is a legal matter now." And then Hannah spoke. "And what about the bigamy?" she demanded. Her arms crossed over her chest. Her voice was sharp, but there was a tremor of hurt beneath it. "Because last time I checked, I was engaged to a single man, not some lying, married scam artist." Daniel finally moved. His chair scraped against the floor as he stood, the sound grating in the tense silence. "Hannah," he said carefully, his voice soft, almost pleading. "I can explain." She let out a bitter laugh, the kind that comes from a place of deep betrayal. "Oh, I'd love to hear this." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal looking for an escape. "Okay, fine," he muttered, his voice low. "Yes, I was seeing you while I was still married. But it wasn't what you think. My marriage to her," he gestured toward me without looking, "was over long ago. We were just dragging things out." I scoffed, leaning back in my chair. "Dragging things out?" I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "You literally tried to trick me into signing over my entire net worth. Sounds pretty active to me." Hannah turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "So everything you told me was a lie? The future? The wedding? Her voice broke for a second, and she swallowed hard. "You told me I was a one." For a moment, something flashed in Daniel's eyes. Regret, panic. It was hard to tell. "I meant it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted us to have a future." "While you're still married," she snapped, her voice rising. "Do you even hear yourself?" Eleanor, still fuming, turned on me. "You set this up," she accused, her finger jabbing in my direction. "You're trying to ruin us." I actually laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Ruin you?" I repeated, shaking my head. "You did that yourselves. I just put the truth on display." Daniel had been silent too long, and that's when I knew he was about to snap. "You think you've won?" he finally said, his voice low and dangerous. Everyone turned to look at him. He wasn't panicked anymore. He was angry. "You act like you're the victim here," he growled, his eyes locked onto mine. "But let's be honest, this was always about power for you. You like feeling superior. You like keeping everything locked away, so I had to come to you for money." I raised an eyebrow, unflinching. "That's an interesting way to describe me protecting my finances from a compulsive liar." His nostrils flared, and his hands clenched into fists. "You never trusted me," he spat. "You never gave me a reason to." "I was your husband," he exploded, slamming his fist onto the table so hard the glasses rattled. "You were supposed to stand by me, not turn on me like this." Hannah took a step back, her face pale. Eleanor looked shaken, and William, for the first time that night, spoke. "Sit down," he ordered, his voice quiet but firm. The authority in it was clear, and Daniel hesitated, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Then, slowly, he sank back into his chair, his hands still clenched into fists. Teresa cleared her throat, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to chaos around her. "Since emotions are running high, let's cut to the chase," she said, flipping through her notes. "First, She held up a document. Hannah has already reported a fraud regarding the money taken from her. That's one charge against you, Daniel. His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Second, Teresa continued, we've already spoken to law enforcement about the fraudulent business loan. And considering the forged signature, that's another charge. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. You called the police? Of course I did. I said, my eyes never leaving Daniel's. Did you really think I was just going to let you walk away? His hands curled into fists, but he stayed silent. Third, Teresa went on, completely unfazed, the Rhode Island estate, that inheritance you were banking on? It seems probate court has some interesting information about how deep in debt this family really is. William's head snapped up. What are you talking about? Teresa smiled, a cold, knowing smile. Oh, you didn't know? Your assets are frozen. The air in the room shifted. Eleanor's face drained of color. No, she whispered, shaking her head. That's not possible. It is, Teresa said. Turns out the real reason you wanted my client to sign everything into a family trust was because you needed her money to pay off your debts. Eleanor shot up from her seat, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is a lie, she shouted, but the way her voice cracked, she knew it wasn't. William knew. Daniel knew. They were done. Eleanor was the first to break. She turned to Daniel, her voice sharp, her eyes furious. You idiot, she hissed. You had one job. You were supposed to make this work, and now we're ruined. Daniel flinched, but then his own anger flared. Don't put this all on me, he snapped. This was your plan just as much as mine, and you were supposed to execute it. You were supposed to execute it, she screeched, her voice rising to a fever pitch. William rubbed his temples, looking 10 years older than he had when the night began. Hannah, shaking, turned to me. I want him arrested, she said, her voice trembling with anger and hurt. Don't worry, I said, my voice calm and steady. It's already in motion. Daniel's head snapped toward me. You wouldn't. I met his stare, unblinking. Watch me. And that's when the sirens wailed outside. Daniel was arrested that night. Fraud, identity theft, bigamy. There was plenty to work with. His parents' estate went into foreclosure within months. Hannah and I went out for drinks the next day, and we toasted to the fact that we had burned them to the ground. Some people say revenge isn't worth it. I disagree. Sometimes, revenge is exactly what's needed.